Hi, I'm Matt Bell, co-founder of Strategic Peace. For those who don't know us, we're a strategy and marketing consultancy focused on helping entrepreneurs, early stage and growth stage businesses identify and hit their next milestones. On our Strategic Peace Talks blog, we try to share ideas and information of interest across a wide range of topics relevant to early stage businesses, including interviews with subject matter experts whose opinions we respect. I recently sat down with Amanda Hsieh, co-founder of the ESG advisory firm Global Affairs Associates. We chatted about all things ESG, including why it's something early stage businesses should care about, and why doing something about it should be high on their agenda. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Please leave a comment on the YouTube page below, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and connect with us on LinkedIn.
So hi, Amanda. Great to talk to you. It's good to be doing this. This is one of our first video segments that we're filming, and trying to cover off some interesting topics here for our Strategic Peace audience. And so the first thing has got to be pronouncing your name correctly, which I hope I did in the intro. I get to live with the name Bell, which, you know, it's boring, but it's very pronounceable, although even people can spell that wrong and stick an E on the end of it. So Hsieh.
That's right, Matt. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on here. It's going to, I think, be exciting to talk about ESG. It's pronounced Hsieh. If anyone in the Houston area watches the news, local news, there is a news reporter. Her name is Maya Hsieh, and she's married to Gene Wu, the rep out in A-Leaf. We spell it differently, but it's pronounced the same. So Amanda Hsieh.
Very nice. Well, we really appreciate you joining us from Global Affairs Associates. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about what Global Affairs Associates does, how you got into that, and then give us a definition. We're talking about ESG. So what are we talking about today?
Sure. So Global Affairs Associates, we are a women-owned ESG and sustainability boutique consultancy. We're located in Houston, Texas. And our focus, our mission is to help our clients, typically companies, increase transparency on social and environmental topics and recognize the economic value from that as well. What we're talking about today is ESG. That stands for environmental, social, governance, the ESG. And that term has kind of evolved from, if anyone's familiar with corporate social responsibility or the word sustainability. And what used to be CSR, maybe corporate social responsibility, maybe 10 years ago, has evolved to a more data-driven approach towards sustainability, towards environmental issues, towards governance issues. It is heavily driven by the investment or the financial sector, and they're the ones who kind of came up with this term ESG, because that's what they are evaluating now, taking to their analysis. What are the environmental management policies, performance, social governance, like that.
It seems to be indeed, as you said, there's just sort of suddenly appeared on everybody's radar screens over the last couple of years. I'm sure it was evolving away like a lot of things in the background. So is CSR dead? And tell me about impact investing, because I think that's another term that's sort of kind of wrapped up in a lot of people's minds in the same arena.
What we like to look at is the continuum of responsible investing. And I'll use this analogy of going into a pool, starting at the shallow end and going to the deep end. So on this continuum of responsible investing, you could have everything from divestment to impact investing. And they're kind of on opposite ends, but divestment being on kind of the shallow end where you're going to slowly get in, and impact investing on the deep end of the pool. And the idea with divestment is it's also called negative screening, where it's simply, I don't want to invest in a certain sector or a certain type of company, or whatever it is, for whatever it could be, because it doesn't align with my values and beliefs. It could be because I just don't think it's a good, financial opportunity, a financial return. Examples of that we've seen for a long time. For example, I don't want to invest in sin stocks, tobacco, alcohol, gambling, something like that. On the next stage, let's say when a little bit deeper in, would be ESG integration, and that's where the asset managers, portfolio managers, are adding environmental, social governance aspects as an additional layer of risk evaluation, risk management, risk analysis that still can be done in the publicly traded markets. Sometimes you're getting into a little bit of private markets, but we see that's the most common approach. I think it's something like 80% is taking that integration approach. The next step deeper into the pool, we're getting into thematic investing. And that's where perhaps it could be a clean energy fund. Again, either publicly traded, private, either way. And then at the deepest end of the pool, because it's more complex, typically it's private markets, a lot more money required, is where investors are looking to make a financial return and an impact, social or environmental, depending on whatever they're looking for.
Thinking about the smaller businesses, I mean, Strategic Piece works almost exclusively with early stage, growth stage businesses. How much of an impact is it having yet, let's say, on the smaller companies?
We can talk kind of about the drivers here, and what's happening is that the large institutional investors, so for example, government pension funds, the pension fund of Norway, the pension fund of Japan as two big examples, big university endowment funds, Harvard, Yale, as two examples, are committing to ESG investing through their portfolios, right? And their portfolios are very diverse. They're going to have, publicly traded stocks and bonds in there. They'll have private equity and hedge funds. They'll have real estate, et cetera, right? And so as they're pushing it down through their supply chain, basically, it's impacting portfolio companies or potentially anyone who wants to be a part of a portfolio company. There's a really interesting report that I refer to a lot called Into the Mainstream, ESG at the Tipping Point. It's by State Street Global Advisors. It was issued last year in November. And what they did was survey about 300 large institutional investors to see how are they integrating ESG into their portfolios, and kind of also what are the kind of barriers or kind of the push and pull factors affecting them. And it was really interesting to see that in end of 2019, the majority of them had said, okay, we've already, implemented this practice in the publicly traded part of our portfolio. Next step is going to be the private equity part. Next step is going to be real estate. So that's why if you're looking for kind of private equity, VC money, it's just rolling down.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people forget that the smaller funds, it's not actually their money they're investing, it's coming from their limited partners, and very often those are larger funds, and the larger funds are taking money from the endowments and the pension funds and the sovereign wealth funds. And so as they expect their money to be put to use in let's say a sustainable way, it cascades down the line, and eventually, even I guess at the very bottom, you've got the angel and seed investors who are actually investing their own personal money. But yeah, I think in mainstream society now, there's a push to know that where your money is getting spent and how it's getting spent is actually sustainable.
Yeah, and I think we might get into this a little bit later, but there's a lot of drivers for this. I mean, not just the institutional investors, but when we're talking, fundraising is, for sure one concern, but also connecting to clients, to employees. And I think we'll get into a little bit more, but I think there's multiple reasons, multiple drivers why, an early stage company might want to, start thinking about ESG and figure out a way that they can, step by step, approach it in a way that makes sense for them.
And I think there's kind of this difference between lip service and actually really doing it, right? I mean, I think back to my days at Shell, big industrial company, and HSE, so health and safety was always talked about in this way. And it's like, yeah, we all say we want to do it and that we will stop work if we see something unsafe, and we're not going to cut any corners, but the reality often isn't quite as rosy as that. And so programs get put in place, and a lot of checklists and procedures and things, but that doesn't necessarily change the culture. It doesn't necessarily change the mindset. And I know when you and I were talking earlier, we were talking about the difference in having an ESG program as opposed to it being sort of more embedded, more part of the culture of the company. And the fact that I think small companies have a chance to put this in from the get-go, rather than it being something that's added on afterwards and then potentially gets shortchanged if there's a budget crunch or something like that.
What makes a difference there is your company's purpose. If you're a purpose-driven company, right, that purpose is going to drive the company culture, drive, let's say, decision-making, right? In every business, we have some critical trade-offs that we have to consider. What are you going to do, A or B? And there's some pretty big trade-offs sometimes, and purpose can guide you. It's clearly this, because this is what our purpose is going to drive us towards. It can also help, unite, let's say, different levels of management and employee if you're a purpose-driven company, because you know this is what we do, this is where we're going towards, and we're able to easily make those decisions about trade-off. We're going to forego option B, we're going to focus here, and this is how we're going to do it. So I think purpose is that, let's see, bigger picture.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Simon Sinek, I'm sure, here, and start with why. I've got my Sinek t-shirt on. If anybody's a real Simon Sinek fan, you'll recognize it. We certainly, we start almost all of our projects with that foundation piece of purpose, mission, vision, and everything needs to tie back to why is this company in business.
If it's not serving that company and purpose, then why are you doing it? And the thing is, with ESG, it is broad enough, flexible enough that there is something for everyone.
So a couple of things I want to talk about. First of all is where does it start? And the other is, do we focus on all of ESG or just parts of it? So let's talk about where it starts. Is this something top down? I mean, purpose tends to be the founder of the company sort of established, this is why I want to be in this business, and grows a team around him or herself to propagate that purpose and actually make it happen. So is that the best starting point, I guess, for ESG thinking as well?
I think it is. I mean, with any big change or initiative, you have to have that buy-in from the top, right? And maybe it doesn't start at the top, but the top has to buy into it. Right. And then depending on the company, depending on their resources, depending on how aggressive they want to be, and they can approach it differently. There's companies that want to maybe start off with a little pilot.
Right.
See how that pilot goes, what are the results, get feedback, let's adjust it, and then slowly expand. They'll take a more conservative approach. Other ones are more aggressive. Let's do this thing.
Yeah. Right.
And so it just depends on the company approach of how, I guess, quickly it's spread out and hopefully embedded one day into the company's organization and operations. But I think early on, the earlier the better to get buy-in from the top, even if it doesn't originate from the top. That buy-in, you got to get it.
So if you're a new company just getting started, that's a little easier than trying to retrofit it to one where the management team kind of got where they are on the ways of the past and are perhaps just hoping to ride it out for a few more years and sell the business. Or let's start with it from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's easier to start with it from the beginning. And again, there's it's something that you can grow into. And I think that's something we always advocate for our companies. We always take what we call a business appropriate approach. What are your vision, mission, strategic goals, and also what are your constraints, right? And then from there, we actually help them build in a multi-year plan of how to approach and work with ESG. But it goes straight back to that point that you were just making. It's easier from the beginning and then slowly grow with it, or grow fast if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go to the other piece of the sort of materiality side of it. I think, we hear a lot about environmental. Everybody's making carbon neutral, carbon zero, carbon negative plans and promises that they want to deliver on. And we hear maybe a little bit less about having, what would the equivalent, governance zero, no governance incidents, I suppose. Maybe the social piece, get a little less press. But if I'm a small company and my environmental footprint is already small, my opportunity to really change much with an ESG approach, focus isn't as great. So how do you view sort of the balance between E and S and G when it comes to what's most impactful from a small business point of view? So
there's a concept in ESG reporting called materiality. We borrow it from financial reporting, if anyone's familiar with SEC reporting and how companies should be reporting on material risks that are substantial to and have a financial impact on the business, and that may, if they're not reported, may cause a reasonable investor to change their investment decision, very broadly, okay? So we've adopted that same term, but a little bit different, broader approach. So it's not only what's material to the company, but also its stakeholders. And that's where we always advise our clients to start with. What's important to you? What's important to your clients, your employees, maybe your community? If you're fundraising, you're looking for investors, right? And map that out and figure out what that is. And if you're, let's say, a service-based company, office-based, your environmental impact, most likely it's going to be relatively small. But your social impact might be huge. Right. Governance always matters. And like you mentioned, there's, I think Uber is a poster child, honestly, for bad social
governance
impact.
gone wrong.
Everyone's gone wrong. And also this culture that was created that was, I don't know if toxic is the right word, but I mean, everything I read about it wasn't a pleasant environment to
Sounds
work
pretty
in.
appropriate to me.
Okay, that's the S of ESG. So, even for tech startups, and again, Uber is just one example and where they actually have also a big environmental impact because of their supply chain, let's say all the drivers. But really the S and the G are very important. And then even in this year with COVID-19, with the Black Lives Matter protest, I mean, we can say that social matters even more. How are you treating your employees during this pandemic? How are we reevaluating diversity, equity, and inclusion? I think those are very powerful social topics that I think, and I understand that as a small business, maybe you feel like your impact is smaller, but you still are impacting your employees, maybe the community around you as well, and what you can do.
And some of it's not necessarily things you're doing in real time all the time, right? It's having a plan for what to do if, and being able to respond. I mean, like a disaster recovery plan or an incident plan would be on the more sort of physical side of things. And so we work with the earlier stage of companies. They very often are seeking investment. And so they're trying to have the right things in place to impress an investor and to meet that investor's criteria. And I think, we all know we have to have a business plan. We've got to have a financial model. We've got to have, enough key people in place to deliver the plan that we're promising on. So how much ESG do we expect an early stage company to have? What sort of things would an earlier stage business want to be doing on the S and the G side that is going to have value when they're talking to investors or trying to hire people?
So I think for an early stage company, of course, you need that buy-in. And if you start moving on your policies and putting them in writing, I think that would be set you apart. And then again, going back to what is material for your company, if there's a key advantage or benefit, a competitive advantage or benefit that you're really trying to communicate to your investors or maybe your customers, I mean, why not go for it? So again, I think it depends a little bit on each company. Yep. And then again, the nice thing is right now it's a big buffet to choose from. You can pick whatever you want from this big buffet to make it work for you. What speaks to your stakeholders, and how can you, again, knowing whatever constraints you have with time and resources, money, every small business has a constraint, how far can you take it, knowing that how important it is to your stakeholders. I think another term we've been hearing also, the last probably 12 months is stakeholder capitalism. Yeah. And even if you're not, let's say, a B Corp or a social enterprise, I think having that awareness that your for-profit business also has a potential positive or negative impact, right, on your stakeholders is really important. And I think demonstrating that understanding at least is critical.
Most small companies they want to do the right thing. They want to create the best business that they can, that they know that that's their pathway to success, to sustain success. They'll be able to retain people. So is there evidence out there that says, yes, smaller businesses are embracing this? And I guess related to that it actually does benefit them when they talk to investors? Or is it people like you telling them that it's good, but is there kind of data to back that up?
I think a study or survey just recently came out last month in July by 500 startups. It could be, a good resource for us to look at, for anyone to look at actually. They surveyed about a little bit over 100 early stage, mostly, majority pre-seed companies. And I think they had some interesting takeaways from that survey. And one of the survey questions was, okay, for the ones who have some, ESG policies in place, and it didn't say specifically what, but just for the ones that already have policies in place, how did it impact your fundraising efforts? And it was interesting because 42% of them said it had a positive effect. 32-ish said, oh, just neutral. It didn't hurt or help, just neutral. So negated out. There were a few that maybe, a small percentage. It was 6% that said it had a negative effect.
Really?
In my head, I'm going back to that question of, well, were they focusing on the material issues? Or were they focusing on something else that was unrelated? Or, just were the investors basically, I could see, criticize them for focusing on
yeah, you've spent so much
maybe
time on that to the
greenwashing.
detriment of something. Oh yeah, you're trying to hide with that something else that you haven't spent the time on that you should have. Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't know that what's behind that small percentage, but what was interesting, I think, is that 40-something% said it was positive, to 70 said it's neutral. So really, I mean, 70%, go for it.
And my guess would be that, you know, we don't have the survey from like last year versus this year, but that those numbers are going up. That more and more companies probably do have things in place, and more investors are sort of expecting it.
I would imagine so. I mean, just going back to our initial conversation about institutional investors and how they're pushing this through their portfolio, it's coming. If it's not there, it's coming. And so I think if it's not this year, it's next year. I think just anecdotally, us, plus many other kind of boutique consulting firms that we know around the country, are getting more and more calls from PEs and VCs. So I guess anecdotal evidence.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, you guys are on the front line of this, so to speak, and you know, I think that's why we like to, you know, have you guys as kind of associates out there when we're talking to you know, a lot of the work that we're doing with our clients is about positioning the business for whatever's coming next, getting to a milestone, and gaining market traction. Well, then you've got your customer there, clearly your stakeholder, growing the business, attracting the right talent. You've got a stakeholder in your employee or your prospect, and later on then for the investor or the acquirer if it's an exit. And so, you know, as we're putting together guidance for our clients, you know, clearly having this sort of stuff in place and consulting with expertise like yours is going to become important. You mentioned something interesting there a moment ago, which was that this survey, that piece of the survey was companies who have things in place already. What about the ones that don't? I mean, are they just Luddites that don't believe in this? Why are they not?
It was something like approximately a third said, you know, we're just too small. A little less than a third said, oh, we haven't really thought about it. And then I think another third kind of said, we're thinking about it, but we haven't done anything. So again, I think a lot of them, like the majority, it's not that it has a negative effect. I think it's increasing awareness. And I think it's trying to understand, again, how can an early stage company approach ESG, that it's not just for, you know, big Fortune 500, you know, whatever companies. There's something for everyone, that it can be tailored to your size of company and to the industry or the market that you're in. And I think you mentioned something about employees earlier, and I think that's something that's really critical to think about for any company who wants to attract talent, and I think that's all of us. In that same survey of the by 500 startups, this startup survey answered 91% of them answered that it helped them to retain or attract talent. And I think that's huge. And then we can also kind of look at that, and with another survey that was done, there's actually been 2 or 3 different surveys done in the past few years of millennials. And depending on the survey, anywhere from 75 to 86% of millennials said they would take a pay cut to work at a company that they thought was aligned with their values. So that's really powerful. And then I think about, you know, the newest kind of generation, you know, it's entering the workforce. That would be Gen Z, and they're in their early to mid 20s now. So there's just entering the workforce. These are also the graduates with, if you're in tech, for example, and you want the brightest minds, you're recruiting right out of college right now. And I mean, we're still learning about Gen Z, but what we generally know about them is their climate anxiety is higher than any previous, you know, demographic. And then we can also, you know, kind of look at this from another perspective too. If that demographic also is basically your customer base, I mean, that's a double reason, right? To start.
So your buyers are going to be thinking that same way. Yeah.
And if we talk about millennials, I mean, it's a very big age group, right? And the older millennials would be in their mid, maybe even late 30s now. So they're in managerial roles, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we just have to recognize that as society and demographics change, that's also another big driver of ESG.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the generational shift. I mean, we talked about back in the beginning about, you know, you might have some sort of gray hairs at the top of the company and you need their buy-in, but the mass, the decision-making influence of a lot of the empowered middle-level people within the business are certainly going to be taking this very seriously. We're talking, I guess, about the US, I mean, your business, my business, we're both here in Houston, so we're in not just the US, but sort of oil and gas country as well. How different is it in Europe, for example? I mean, we think of Europe being this sort of land of the greenies that miles ahead of the US in terms of renewables and other aspects. Is the wave breaking in the same direction with ESG thinking as well?
I think they're ahead of the US in this. And again, if we kind of break it down into their stakeholders as well, very generally. But the consumers are much more aware there of environmental issues for sure. Regulators have put in place regulations in the last few years, very recently actually, regarding ESG reporting. It's mandatory basically in most of Europe, and I think there's some parameters around that. And even this year, the central bank started doing climate stress tests of the banking system. So, if you're interested in working, selling, hiring
right.
in Europe, being involved in Europe and having a European footprint, right, to your business, I think it's smart to start considering that and adapting that into your business. Because
and the internet knows no boundaries, right? So, I mean, if you're any kind of tech business that's really just operating over the internet rather than physical product, yeah, you want to have access to those markets too.
Absolutely. So I think the stakeholders there are more aware, more concerned than we are about certain issues. I think it's just understanding who your stakeholders, again, going back to that and understand what's important, what's material to them, and making sure you're speaking to that.
And you mentioned something there that in Europe, there's now compulsory reporting. It's become a regulatory requirement. So for the uninitiated here in the US, there's actually, even for the bigger corporations, it's not yet a requirement like you've got to do your SEC financial filings or whatever. It's not the same in this case.
It's not. In the US, we don't have, let's say, requirements for any company, any publicly traded company typically is what's regulated, right, by the SEC to report on their environmental or social. A lot of companies are already reporting on their governance structure, right? That's very common in their annual filings. And some companies are starting to report on some of their environmental or social risks, but it's just one of the many risks, let's say, in the material risk. It'll be one of, and it'll be, maybe this bunch of it.
Right.
So the good thing about that is that when it's voluntary, you can use it to how it serves you. And while it's still the wild west of ESG, as we like to call it, and there's multiple frameworks, there's multiple different ESG ratings and rankers and surveys that you can apply to, use the ones that work best for you. I do think that, one day there will be some, mandatory ESG reporting in the US, whether that's, in 2 years with a change of administration, or maybe it's, 5 to 7 years without a change of administration in November, who knows? But it is, being discussed, let's say, by regulators and by Congress. Just as an example, this year the SEC had a request for comments about ESG fund names. And we, provided comments, and they're on our website in case anyone wants to read them. But I think that's just, one small example of how it is being discussed. But we'll see when it actually becomes, mandatory by regulators. On the other hand, it is quickly becoming the market standard because of large institutional investors, because of big companies like BlackRock, for example. It is very quickly becoming standard for companies to issue a sustainability or ESG report.
Right.
I think this year it was something like 90% of the S&P 500 companies had issued ESG or sustainability report. And, one of the things that we talk about in my company is that if you're not talking about ESG, you're potentially being passed over. And knowing that the larger companies tend to report more, smaller companies tend not to report more, we have a concern here that our smaller companies being passed up simply because they're not communicating about the good things they're doing. Right. And we think that's a missed opportunity and a risk.
Absolutely.
And that's why we help companies of all sizes, big and small, with understanding ESG and helping to increase transparency in a way that's appropriate for them so they can access that capital.
And I think it's like a lot of other layers of business. There's, or aspects of business, there's layers to it. So, when we look at companies' financial systems, and, you start your business running it with a spreadsheet, everybody does. And then maybe you go to QuickBooks because that's the next easiest thing to do. And you reach a point of, well, do I want to invest in an ERP system, a big financial package? And I know I'm going to need it eventually, but I'm trying to get acquired. And so is it necessary to have that in place before the investors look at me? And I think, yeah, there's plenty of anecdotal evidence that says, yes, if they look at you and you've already got some of those things in place, they're going to say, lower commercial risk, easier to do my due diligence, whatever it is, and not pass over maybe an even better business that hasn't invested in sort of growing its tools, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that's got to get cleared out and upgraded. And so I would think similar here, if they've taken the time to put some of the thought into it and at least lay the groundwork, you're more attracted to the next layer up that's going to ultimately be your strategic acquirer.
And I think about maybe you're not fundraising, but maybe you're already thinking about your exit strategy and you're looking to be acquired.
Right.
And, we have clients that have come to us because of that specifically in mind. They want to demonstrate that they are aligned with potential buyers, that the integration would be fairly easy, with that potential buyer. So I think, depending on, where you are in the process, whether you're in the early stages of raising money, or if you're already thinking about the exit and you maybe have a short list of, your target buyers that you bought out. I think it'd be good to do some market research to see, how are they communicating on ESG? What are they talking about? And how can you start, this process of aligning yourself so you're attractive to them?
So if I'm going to go, and again, let's talk about the smaller businesses that don't have regulatory filings and these kinds of things. So these are private companies, but they've got a website, they've got social media channels. So presumably that's the good place to start looking and seeing, what are they actually saying? What are they actually doing? Are they exhibiting the tendencies of a company that's really thinking about this, or is it just kind of all over the map?
Unless you're attracting impact investors, I'll say that, and you making your operations are to make an impact. You're a social entrepreneur. I mean, I think then maybe it becomes more important, but I think for the majority of us small businesses, early stage companies, I think it's, putting some information out there that resonates, that's authentic to you and authentic to your company's brand on your website, making sure that messaging is consistent in your social media post, right? And that goes back into branding and, authenticity. And I'm sure you guys help, companies with that as well. But I think that's a very easy starting point, low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, no, and you're right, we do. We talk about consistency, we talk about credibility. We talk about alignment a lot, because you can say one thing and do another, and people will take one look at you and disappear. We also talk about, you see a customer once they fill in a form on your website, or they, you meet them maybe at a trade show, they come to your booth when trade shows happen again, but they've probably had 6, 8, 10 touch points with your business before that, unbeknownst to you, as they've become aware of you and checked you out online, and maybe they followed you on a social media channel to see, is this the kind of business that I want to do business with, work for, whatever it is. And so that external consistency becomes really important, because each of those touch points needs to add up. If they don't add up, that's going to leave a sense that company isn't what they're saying they are, isn't what they're cracked up to be. I saw an interesting report probably a couple of months ago now that was talking about companies claiming to use artificial intelligence and machine learning. That was a European report, and I think whoever had investigated it, I think it was a university, found about half of the companies weren't actually doing anything with it at all. They were just saying they were, and once you dug a bit below the surface, it quickly fell apart. So you better be upfront, be honest about what you're really doing. Don't make false claims.
I think I don't know what that's called. That would be like greenwashing for ESG, and I don't know if that's tech washing or whatever, what
probably,
what the other term would be, but.
It's not surprising, because I think there's a lot of pressure on companies always to seem like they're at the cutting edge, to seem like they're leading the way. And I don't know if that's necessarily an ESG thing, but indeed, greenwashing, trying to look better than you are, not necessary, right?
I mean, I think we're always careful in how we develop the key messages for our clients. How do they talk about what they're doing in a way that is nuanced to their industry, demonstrates they understand the risk and opportunities, but also it's authentic, it's appropriate, and so that, again, it's nuanced. And I think there's ways to talk about ESG about how you're thinking about it, what your policies are, your approaches, in a way that's realistic and authentic. And I think that's really important.
Can I download a bunch of best practices and templates to do this and sort of adapt that to my needs, or am I better off starting kind of blank sheet of paper?
I think it's like anything. There's tools, right? There's best practices and tools, but it's always, we always advise really to adopt it to your company, because your company is unique.
Yeah.
And your constraints are unique. Your vision and strategic goals are going to be different. Where you are is going to be different. And that may impact, your customer base, the regulatory, environment. So yes, there's, a bunch of great tools out there, best practices, but it's really how do you tailor that then to your business to make it work for you. Again, that's the nice thing about having this wild west of ESG, as we like to call it, is because you can pick and choose to what works for you, and be strategic about it. Take a multi-year approach, let it grow with you as you grow too. You don't have to, just take it's a journey. And so just take one step at a time. We work with companies that are taking that very first step. And then we also work with companies that have been doing this for 20 years, but they want to refresh. And I think there's always, it's always evolving. And I think that's, for me, that's what makes it fun.
Yeah, well, like a lot of different aspects of business, it's constantly changing. I know you guys have some great resources on your website, and so we'll put a link to that and to the other surveys and things that we've been talking about. We'll put those in with the transcript so people can go afterwards and educate themselves on the wonderful world of ESG. Awesome conversation. Let's leave our viewers, listeners, and readers with some takeaways, some things that they could do, kind of right now. What would be your sort of 4 or 5 hot tips if someone was going to say, right, I feel the need. We've got to do better on ESG at my company. Where would they start tomorrow?
I have a feeling we'll align on some of our top 5. Number 1, purpose.
Yep.
What is the purpose of your company?
Talked about earlier. Absolutely. Yeah.
Mission, vision, values, kind of associated with that. To make sure you have kind of your North Star, let's say. Your North Star, your initial roadmap of how you're going to get to that destination. That's number 1. Number 2 is education. There's, whether it's coming to our website, attending one of our classes, we have them almost monthly. The next one up is called ESG Decoded. It's actually a foundational class. If anyone's interested in ESG reporting, that's perfect for you. But there's a ton of resources out there to get started. So education. And then number 3, I would say, is market research. That means research on your customers, on your potential, whoever your target investors are, or maybe it's your target, buyers. What are they thinking about ESG? How are they communicating about it? If it's maybe your investors or, even a buyer or a potential client, what industry associations are they a part of? What are those industry associations talking about? How are they approaching it? If it's all about low carbon, that would give you a strong hint. Yep. Your messaging needs to go towards the energy transition and the transition to a low carbon economy, right? If they're talking a lot about diversity inclusion, how can you start talking and incorporating that into your company? And then I think going back to our topic, if you're looking to expand geographically, just be aware of this different stakeholders. And again, that's your market research too. What do the stakeholders in that market, whether it's your customers, potential customers, or your employees or regulators, how are they approaching all this? And how do you need to adapt to speak to them as well?
Very nice. I do agree, definitely, with, obviously the purpose thing and education. We're always trying to educate ourselves. It is a fast-moving area. But it reminds me again of safety, and nobody notices the safety culture or the safety procedures and processes when they're working. It's when they don't work and you have an accident or an incident that all of a sudden they can take you down. And I think governance is in that same boat. Maybe even some of the social stuff right now. Companies have been barreling along, having all white male boards and management teams, and you can't just click your fingers and say, right, we're going to replace 35% of those people with women and people of color. It's not, your damage is done because you haven't worked on it throughout the process. So we've all got the horror stories. So you've got the Ubers and the WeWorks, the sort of disaster stories. Are there some good stories about real success cases? I mean, companies that have done really well with this and stood out from the crowd?
I bet there are. For some reason, the crash and burn stand out more.
They are, right? Everybody loves to watch it.
The dramatic crash and burns always go like, wow, those are the ones you remember. And and that, what does that say about, you know, where my brain goes? But
I think it's human nature. I mean, we drive slowly past rubbernecking the car wreck, right? I mean, we just love to watch other people suffer from catastrophe.
I'm sure there are. It's just funny, really. But my head goes to those, crash and burn cases.
Maybe it's the turnarounds. Maybe it's going to be the people that have worked with Uber afterwards, or the ones that have helped, assuming WeWork gets back on its feet, and said how you can rescue a business. It's not necessarily doomed to fail just because.
It's hard though, right? Because part of it, when you think about some of it's the governance structure, which, you know, you can do, and it's just hard, but you can do it. And this, I think the harder bit is company culture, and how do you turn that around and change that? And that's, I think, what we're watching at Uber, right?
Right.
Happening there with the new CEO that was put in place, a year or two or whatever it was ago. And now they're in another, let's say, a social controversy with their contractors / employees.
Right. Yeah.
So I think there's, you know, even though I think that goes back to, you know, you may have a small environmental footprint. Again, Uber's arguable. I think the social aspect is really important.
Amanda Hsieh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Really appreciate you joining us for a conversation. Like I said, we'll put the websites and other links up as part of the transcript when we post this onto the website. Closing thoughts, anything else we need to think about? Leave us with one thing, front of mind, before we close.
Don't be scared, just do it.
I like it very much. Well, really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time. We'll speak again soon.
Thank you.